Sir Bill Wiggin.
I'm very grateful and pleased to follow my honourable friend, the Minister and Member for Taunton Deane. I wish she had explained why, under the current legislation, they allowed these animal parts to be imported in the first place, because you have to have a licence to bring them in. So the legislation is already in place. And I recognise that this is an emotionally weighted subject. I've had plenty of emails from well-meaning people with kind hearts who want to defend and protect animals from being hunted. And I think we heard that from colleagues here this morning. To them it seems unfair and unnecessary, and a contest and one which they believe that we can do without. Sadly, this is not quite as simple as they hope, and that is why this legislation is not quite as necessary as it's been made out. The fundamental problem for wildlife is people. And as we reach 8 billion people, I hope that this is a fact on which we can agree. However, keeping wildlife habitats safe and protected from people is far more complicated and more important. We need a pragmatic approach to this divisive issue. We use land ownership and money to manage habitats. We've seen land disputes and wildlife competing with domestic crops and livestock, sadly to the detriment of the wildlife. So we need to appreciate what it's like to live with large and dangerous or endangered species. We cannot expect people in rural Africa to have the same views on this subject as the voters in, say, Crawley. And that is why telling Africans, however you choose to cushion the message, how to manage their wildlife seems to me to be fundamentally wrong, post-colonial and possibly racist. And I cannot stand by and allow this to go uncriticised. In fairness to my honourable friends, my unhappiness with the racist elements in this message are not a reflection on their views or the views of any colleagues, and we've heard that today. But for me, we must stand up to racism in whatever form it takes. So before you email me about trophy hunting, please consider that it is this racist issue that is the real problem for me. Racism is illegal, and I accept that you may disagree with me, but while we're on the subject of legality, we must be clear about the distinction between illegal and legal hunting. There is a great deal of misinformation, but where hunting programmes are well regulated and legal, only carefully selected animals are hunted. Rather than diminishing endangered species, these programmes instead protect habitat and work to support conservation. Here in the UK, we do not have to coexist with big or dangerous animals like those which African people have to contend with. So before we condemn other countries for their wildlife management, we ought first to consider what the people who live there actually think. Now, I was sent a survey by the Humane Society claiming that polling in South Africa was against hunting, and I've heard colleagues mention it this morning. It did not mention the wording of the questions, but what I really noticed was that there was no data on what people thought about allowing the UK to determine South African wildlife policy. Contrary to the email I got from Jane Goodall, I have had no contact with any Americans or Russians, but I have had contact, by and large, from African community leaders and conservationists who do not support the UK in its proposed bill to ban UK imports of hunting trophies. The reason being... Yeah, I'd be delighted to.
Would the right honourable gentleman indicate whether or not he took the trouble to research the fact that a number of those African contacts from which he heard have direct contacts and relationships with Safari Club International?
I don't really care if the people who've put their name to the emails have had contact with Safari Club International. They've written to me. Safari Club International has not. Well, when my constituents write to me, I don't find out who they've been in contact with. I deal with their emails. And I'll read one to him in a moment, because I think it's quite helpful. Well, the honourable gentleman intervened on me, and I'm trying to answer his intervention. If he doesn't want to know, he probably shouldn't have intervened. But actually, when people write to you, you take on board their words, not who they may have been in contact with. And I think to have some sort of sinister agenda behind every email would be peculiar. But let me help him with this one. My name is Maxi Louis, and I'm the director of the Namibian Association of Community-Based Natural Resource Management Support Organisations. With the second reading of the Hunting Trophies Import Prohibition Bill coming up this Friday, I wanted to reach out to emphasise the importance of what happens with this bill. People like myself who work on the front lines of this issue in communities that look after wildlife know the importance of licensed and regulated hunting to sustainable conservation. While the bill would regulate UK activity in regard to international hunting, African people would be directly impacted. Our voices are loud and clear, demanding the UK adopt an evidence-led solution, a smart ban on the importation of trophies from unlicensed and unregulated hunting. There is overwhelming evidence from international academics and conservationists that a smart ban would underpin the funding model for local conservation projects and local economies. A total ban would take away important benefits from the communities I work with. Please see below my signature for the graphics with key facts on the issue. And the key facts, he said, were that 53,400 jobs in Eastern and Southern Africa are supported by trophy hunting. Well, he may not care if that's true or not, but I suspect the 53,400 people concerned do. 60% of all cash fees received by Namibian conservancies came from licensed hunting. 100% of game fees go to local communities in Namibia. In Tanzania, that's 55%, and in Zambia, that's 50%. So these are the people that are writing. Their links to the Safari Club of America may or may not be there, but those figures are very verifiable, and I'm sure that he will check on them. So I think it's quite important that we do listen to people who we're going to affect, rather than say that we don't care about it. And the reason being is that wildlife conservation is vital for their economies. They rightly argue that it is not for us in the West to decide how they should manage their wildlife. And that is why I cannot endorse this bill, because it would remove financial incentives for habitat and wildlife protection in these countries, threatening African people's livelihoods, and interfere with the decision-making of African democratic governments. Indeed, Mr. Deputy Speaker, we had the President of South Africa here on Tuesday. I was delighted to be able to hear him speak in the Royal Gallery. He never mentioned that he was hoping that we would remove the licensing regime for South African trophies. He did talk about sustainability and the future of the planet. But I don't think he was aware of this bill. And he is very important, as he actually has a game farm. He achieved a record price for his buffalo, which were being bred for the size of their horns, as this is what a trophy requires. Yes, this is the President of South Africa, who was here this week, the President of a G20 country, which is responsible for the largest big game and trophy hunting sector. Its President has a farm called Fala Fala, and so you can see why I have real doubts about the validity of the claims that most Africans want us to bring in this bill. These are supposed to be South Africans with votes, and I'm sure that they are more than capable of deciding how they want to manage their wildlife without our intervention. A key distinction lies between licensed hunting that contributes to conservation initiatives and illegal poaching of wildlife. We've repeatedly seen, and we heard this morning, the evocative image of Cecil the lion that is used by those advocating a ban on trophy hunting as a mascot to stir up support for their campaign. And yet what was not acknowledged today, and they always fail to acknowledge, is that the hunters involved, Walter Palmer and Theo Bronkhurst, were taken to court for illegally killing Cecil the lion in Zimbabwe in 2015. This emotive case has been repeatedly extrapolated to all hunting to fuel emotions to ban the trophy hunting campaigns. While a briefing by the International Union for Conservation of Nature, I suspect my right honourable friend expects that that's something to do with America, from 2016 condones illegal hunting, it maintains that legal, well-regulated trophy hunting programmes can and do play an important role in delivering benefits for both wildlife conservation and for the livelihoods and well-being of indigenous and local communities. By introducing this bill, we would be undermining support for licensed hunters who operate professionally and contribute to conservation efforts in Africa, and this would result in a great deal more poachers who disregard the law and cruelly kill animals for their illegal trade. In their open letter to the US Fish and Wildlife Service in 2009, the World Wildlife Fund recognised the value of limited, managed hunting of black rhinos in Namibia, stating that it can strongly contribute to the enhancement of the survival of the species. In Namibia, hunting is permitted between February and November under tight regulation. While proponents of the ban argue that elephants are endangered, and obviously we all care about that, Namibia alone claimed to have more than 24,000 elephants in March this year. That's the most it's had in over 100 years. According to Africa Geographic, elephant numbers in Namibia already exceed what many would be considerable desirable for the available habitat. This is clearly a welcome endorsement of post-colonial wildlife management by Africans, for Africans, in Africa. But it also poses a threat to other rare and vulnerable species, not to mention human lives. In 2013, there were 5,000 problem-causing animal incidents reported in Namibia, some of which resulted in the loss of human life. In order to prevent lethal encounters with humans, the Namibian government argued for roundups of elephants that would help control numbers and fund their conservation efforts. When big game hunting was banned in Botswana, local farmers lived in fear due to the rapidly increasing population of elephants, not just for their crops and livelihoods, but also for their lives. Prior to the lifting of the hunting ban in Botswana, elephants were so populous that in 2018, 36 people were killed by elephants in the country, with many more suffering injuries. In 2019, Botswana reversed its ban on hunting, recognising the important role of hunting for conservation purposes. And they're not alone. Pohamba Shiefta, Namibia's Environment and Tourism Minister, remarked that foreigners curtailing prize hunting would be the end for conservation in Namibia. South Africa boasts 90% of the world's population of the southern white rhino, and yet they permit hunting. Whereas in Kenya, where hunting is banned, the numbers of white rhino fell significantly due to poaching, to the point that they then had to buy their white rhinos from South Africa. Now, this surely demonstrates the necessity of supporting these countries in order to promote the conservation of wildlife. People in support of the ban are rightly concerned about the killing of endangered species. That is why CITES is so important and why we need to strengthen it rather than overrule it with the proposed ban. By supporting the wildlife management industry economically, we're ensuring that there is better regulation of hunting and more training provided for professional hunters and trackers to ensure safety. As recognised by the International Union for Conservation of Nature, instead of banning trophy hunting, we should encourage better regulation of hunting, known as a smart ban, and support responsible national agencies to improve on-the-ground management. Professor Keith Somerville, a Fellow of the London Zoological Society, who specialises in conservation in Africa, has highlighted that hunting safari operators police their shooting areas in order to prevent poaching. For example, in Botswana, the hunting ban saw an increase in the number of poachers due to the soaring population of elephants and the lack of game reserve patrols. Instead of channeling our efforts into eradicating trophy hunting, we should instead support better regulation of big game hunting to help reduce poaching, a cruel and anti-conservationist practice. The biggest threat to African wildlife and wildlife in Africa is the human incursion that they face, which will only get worse with an ever-increasing human population. So in order to incentivize local communities to protect the habitats for these animals, they need to be rewarded for their efforts. When wildlife has a value, people treat it better. So while it might be easy for campaigners to raise emotional stories of animals being cruelly killed to justify the bill, however, in using compelling and upsetting stories of humans brutally killing animals to campaign for the ban on hunting, they have failed to recognise the importance of the industry for the human livelihoods and well-being of the people who live in these countries. By raising this bill, we are fighting for an issue that will have virtually no impact on our daily lives. While it may make us feel virtuous to introduce a ban on trophy hunting imports in the UK, in doing so, we would be undermining a vital source of income for African people. So no matter what you feel, you are sending out a message that white people, people like me, know better and care less about black people in Africa who are more successful at wildlife management than white people were when we ruled those countries. African stakeholders, in their open letter to DEFRA in 2020, argued that a UK ban on the trophies of animals hunted in Africa would have devastating consequences for conservation and their livelihoods. In their letter, they pleaded that we uphold their basic human right to sustainably use the natural resources on which their communities' livelihoods depend. They continued, without markets for high-value, low-impact hunting, we will not be able to sustain conservation or feed our children. Not only would a ban on imports of trophies to the UK have devastating effects on the livelihoods of individuals in Africa, it would also have financial repercussions for the wider economies in these countries. Hunting in particular has grown to be one of the most important industries in Namibia in terms of GDP and rural uplift contribution. Africa Geographic estimates that $40 million Namibian dollars is generated per year across 79 conservancies in Namibia. Now, you may say that there are alternative sources of income for African communities. However, it's worth considering the viability of the proposed alternatives. If there was a total ban on hunting in these countries, local people would likely use the land for farming instead. Ironically, this would result in far fewer wild animals, as they would be viewed as a threat to their livelihood rather than an asset. Some UK conservationists have proposed that photographic tourism, and we've heard it today, in place of hunting might be used to support local economies. But in some areas, phototourism is just not viable, and the only source of revenue is derived from hunting. Former Chief Executive of the World Wildlife Fund in South Africa, Dr. John Hanks, acknowledges that certain areas are more well-suited to photographic safaris than hunting. But he argues that in areas where wildlife is more sporadic and the landscape more mundane, hunting may be the only profitable use of the land. Daneen van der Westerhuizen is a professional hunter who grew up in Namibia and highlighted that big game tourism attracts far fewer people but much higher profits, estimating that one trophy hunter brings in the same revenue into Namibia as 2,000 tourists. Indeed, one hunter might pay as much as £45,000 to shoot just one animal. Therefore, so many more tourists are required to visit these areas in order to provide an equivalent profit. That makes ecotourism far less environmentally friendly than big game tourism, because a higher number of people visiting game reserves impacts on local flora and fauna and disrupts habitats for wildlife. There are also those who suggest that agriculture would be a much better use of the land than hunting. But in certain areas, hunting is a far better land use option than domestic livestock and crops, because it protects biodiversity and incentivises local people to protect these large animals. Ironically, by banning hunting and instead endorsing the use of land for farming, there would be fewer wild animals as they are a threat. Finally, let me come to the issue that we should not be deciding on. African people manage the conservation of wildlife that is some 6,000 miles away from us here in the UK. A ban on trophy imports as a means to banning hunting seems to me to be colonialist behaviour. Animal rights lobbies are lobbying hard to see this bill pass, but Botswana's president, the current president, not one from the past, Mogwitsi Maisisi, has asked why Western conservationists should be intervening. The president of Botswana is asking why we are intervening and deciding what happens to their elephants. Many Africans have rightly taken offence to Western conservationists attempting to puppeteer their wildlife management, despite it having no bearing on the daily lives of us here back in the UK. In an open letter to Ricky Gervais, Joanna Lumley, Peter Egan, Ed Sheeran, Dame Judi Dench and Piers Morgan in 2020, over 50 African community leaders urged British celebrities to stop exerting their influence to jeopardise wildlife conservation efforts. They stated, imposing worldviews and value systems from faraway places, amplified through your powerful, influential voices, results in disastrous policies that undermine our rights and conservation success. The Ban on Trophy Hunting website uses anecdotes from 300 years ago to convince readers that hunting is some sort of colonialist sport. Yet African stakeholders, in their open letter to DEFRA, liken the behaviour of these Western conservationists to that of European colonialists who removed the rights of local people to manage their own land and animals. They highlighted that the post-independent governments have restored their rights to sustainably manage their wildlife by providing socio-economic incentives for doing so. An estimated 50 to 90% of these economic incentives derive from regulated, sustainable and humane hunting, which has resulted in wildlife population and habitat expansion. On the surface, this bill may only appear to change our import laws here in the UK. But I think there's no secret that ultimately a vote for this bill is a vote for instructing African democratic governments on how to behave. And that is why I cannot endorse it. It should not be up to us to stop hunting in these countries, but for their own governments to manage their wildlife and their conservation. Because it's not us that's affected. It is them who will be affected. And of course, no one wants to encourage illegal hunting, but by withdrawing our support for legal and well-regulated hunting in these countries, we are in effect removing the financial incentives that encourage African people to protect their local wildlife and habitats. So that is why I support the current licensing system for CITES, listed species, to protect vulnerable species and regulate imports to the UK. And I wish the Minister had used her comments to explain why she wasn't using that licensing regime to stop the imports of the various trophies that people object to. Because that's what it's there for. And if you use the CITES website on the government u.gov system, it's extremely helpful. If you type in the type of animal you want to ask about, it will tell you that you need a license. It lists them in their taxonomic order, by their Latin names, by their English names. It's an extremely good website. And I'm fairly faint in my praise for government websites generally, but this one is good. You can tell if you're allowed to bring these species in or if you're not. And if you're not, then you have to have a license. And all the animals that this bill will protect are already licensed imports. So I was standing on a manifesto to protect our borders. We have the legislation in place to do it. So this is gilding the lily. It's extra. It isn't necessary, and it is deeply wrong, because I think it's up to African people to decide how they manage their rich natural resources that are in their backyard and not ours.